Tonight, we step very quietly into the past. There is no rush here. There is no hurry. We are moving slowly, the way smoke moves through still air, the way flour settles after it has been sifted, drifting down through the light in soft, pale curtains. We are not going anywhere quickly tonight. We are simply going to sit for a while and breathe and listen and let the story of one of the oldest, simplest, and most comforting things in all of human history wash gently over us. We are going to talk about bread. Just bread. That is all. The warm, quiet, humble, ancient thing that has sat at the center of nearly every human table in nearly every corner of the world for thousands and thousands of years. We are going to trace its long, unhurried story from the very beginning, from the moment when someone, somewhere, long before any city or any writing or any name we could speak, first pressed wet grain between flat stones and placed it near a fire and waited, and found that something entirely new had come into the world. It is a gentle story, a slow story, a story full of flour dust and firelight, of stone floors still warm from the sun, of the low sound of grinding, of bread cooling on a flat rock while the stars begin to appear. It is a story of ordinary days, ordinary hands, ordinary hunger, satisfied in the simplest, most ancient way. So let us begin very softly. Let us go back as far as we can go and let the story of bread carry us. The very earliest bread was not really what we might recognize as bread today. There were no ovens, no loaves, no golden crusts, no braided shapes rising in warm kitchens. The earliest bread was something much simpler, much rougher, much closer to the earth it came from. It was a kind of paste, or perhaps a thick flat cake, made by crushing wild grains against a stone and mixing the result with a little water, and then setting that flat wet thing near the heat of a fire until it dried and hardened and became something that could be held and eaten without crumbling away to nothing. We know this happened. We can be quietly certain of it because of what archaeologists have found in the remains of ancient encampments and caves and open settlements in places where people lived tens of thousands of years ago. They found grinding stones, smooth and worn in the particular way that comes from long, repeated use, from hands pressing down and moving in slow circles over grain. They found residue, tiny traces of wild plant material caught in the cracks and surfaces of those old stones, and when those traces were carefully studied and slowly understood, they revealed something remarkable and very calm at the same time. People had been processing wild grains long, long before anyone planted a field or dug an irrigation channel or raised a wall. It began, as so many things begin, with simple observation. Someone noticed that wild grasses carried small, hard seeds at their tops. Someone noticed that these seeds, when crushed, produced something fine and pale and dense. Someone noticed that this fine, pale thing, mixed with water, became something cohesive, something that could be shaped. And someone, perhaps by accident, perhaps by slow and patient experiment, noticed that this flat-shaped thing, left near the heat of a fire, became harder and drier and easier to carry and easier to eat without making a mess of your hands. There is something very restful about imagining this. The slow, unhurried process of discovery. No sudden revelation, no dramatic moment of invention, just the gradual accumulation of small observations passed from one person to the next over generations and generations until something that might eventually be called bread had quietly, almost imperceptibly, come into being. Slowly, over many thousands of years, people began to understand grains better. They began to notice which grasses produce the most seeds, and which seeds produce the finest flour when ground, and which flat stones wore down the least over time from the constant circular motion of grinding. They began to notice where these wild grasses grew most thickly, which slopes and riverbanks and flat open places produced the most grain in a season. And at some point, slowly and not all at once, some groups of people began to return to those places deliberately and to tend them, and eventually to cultivate them, pressing seeds into turned earth in the spring and returning in the autumn to gather what had grown. This is not a dramatic story. It did not happen in a single season or even a single generation. It happened the way most truly important things happen in human history, which is to say, it happened gradually, almost without anyone fully understanding that something was changing, that the world was shifting into a new shape around the small, quiet, repeated actions of ordinary people going about their ordinary days. We do not need to dwell on all the complexity of those changes tonight. It is enough to hold in mind the simple image of someone crouching near a fire, somewhere in what we might now call the Middle East, perhaps 12,000 years ago, pressing a flat, wet disk of crushed grain paste against a warm, flat stone and watching it slowly change, slowly firm up, slowly become something that smelled different from the raw grain and tasted different too. Something richer and warmer and more satisfying in a deep, wordless way. That is where we begin. Let us move very gently to a place and time we know a little better. Let us go to the river. There is a wide, slow river, and on either side of it the land is very flat and very green, and the sky above is a pale, washed blue, and the air is already warm, though the sun has not yet fully risen. The reeds along the river bank are still, and the water moves quietly, carrying small reflections of the early light on its surface. There are birds somewhere, not singing loudly but simply making small, intermittent sounds, the way birds do in the early morning when the day is not yet fully itself. This is Egypt, roughly 4,000 years ago, though it could be somewhat earlier or somewhat later than that, and it would look very much the same. The details of daily life here moved slowly, the way the river itself moves, in long, quiet seasons, one following another. We are going to spend some time here. We are going to follow a day in this place, and we are going to pay attention to the bread, because Egypt is one of the places where bread became, for the first time, a truly serious and sophisticated thing, a thing made in many different ways, for many different purposes, a thing that sat at the very center of life in a way that would not change for thousands of years. The morning begins in a house near the edge of a town. It is not a large house. The walls are made of mud brick, which is to say brick made from the clay of the riverbank mixed with straw and pressed into rectangular forms and dried slowly in the sun until it is hard and pale and very slightly rough to the touch. The walls are thick because thick walls hold out heat, and the floor is packed earth, smooth from long use, still cool from the night. There is a single window opening, not glazed, letting in the pale early light and a faint movement of air that carries the smell of the river, something cool and green and a little mineral like wet stone. A woman rises from a mat on the floor. She does not hurry. She moves in the way of someone accustomed to long mornings, in the way of someone who has done the same set of morning things so many times that her body knows each step before her mind fully reaches it. She drinks a little water from a clay pot that has been sitting in the coolest corner of the room overnight, and the water is not cold, but it is not unpleasant. It is simply water, familiar and sufficient. The first task of the morning is the grain. There are two large flat stones in the corner of the room, one resting slightly on top of the other, both worn to a particular smoothness in the center from years and years of use. The lower stone is fixed, set into a shallow depression in the earth floor so that it does not slide, and the upper stone is smaller and can be held in both hands and moved back and forth in long, slow, rhythmic strokes. Beside the stones is a clay jar containing emmer wheat, one of the ancient grains that has grown along this river for longer than any living person can remember or any story can account for. The kernels are small and hard and brownish, and they catch the early light and seem almost to glow for a moment, though that is perhaps only the imagination. She takes a small handful of grain and places it between the stones and begins to grind. The sound of this is one of the oldest sounds in the world. It is a low, steady, slightly rough sound, not unpleasant, rhythmic in the way that makes it very easy to fall into a kind of slow attention, a kind of half-dreaming wakefulness. The grain shifts and breaks, and slowly, over many slow strokes, begins to give up its flour. The flour is not fine, not the way flour can be made fine with metal mills and long sifting processes, but it is flour nonetheless, pale tan and slightly gritty, carrying the faint warm smell of the grain that made it. She grinds for a while. There is no particular urgency. The flour accumulates slowly at the edges of the lower stone, and from time to time she sweeps it gently into a clay bowl. The morning light moves across the floor as the sun rises, and the air in the room begins to warm slightly, and outside there are more sounds now, the soft movements of other people beginning their own mornings in the houses nearby. When she has enough flour, she pours it into a larger bowl and adds water, carefully, a little at a time, pressing the mixture with her fingers until it comes together into a dough. The dough is dense and slightly sticky and smells of grain and water and the faint earthiness of the bowl itself. She works it slowly, pressing and folding and turning, not with great effort, but with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who knows exactly how long this takes and has long since made peace with that length of time. In Egypt at this period, bread was made in many ways, and this is one of the gentler, quieter ways, the way of a household making its daily bread for the people who live and work there. Not the great bakeries of the temples or the palace, but the small domestic bread that fed the workers and the families in the ordinary days. The dough will sit for a while before it is shaped. Perhaps it has been mixed with a little of the previous day's dough, kept back in a small piece, and left to ferment slowly in the warmth of the room, so that it carries within it the beginnings of something alive, a slow bubbling and rising that will make the finished bread a little lighter than it would otherwise be. Or perhaps it is simply flatbread today, unleavened, made quickly and cooked on the flat ceramic dish that sits over the small fire in the corner of the courtyard. Not much changes in the morning in this house. The sounds are gentle and repetitive and very, very old. Let us stay in this morning a little longer because it deserves more attention than we often give it. The courtyard of the house is small but open to the sky, and the sun is reaching it now, laying a soft rectangle of pale gold light across the packed earth. There is the fig tree in one corner, not large, with smooth gray bark and leaves that are beginning to open fully in the morning warmth, and it gives a small amount of shade that will be welcome later in the day when the heat settles in earnest. There is also a low clay oven in the courtyard, not tall, shaped roughly like an inverted pot, its interior still holding some of the warmth of the previous day's fire. This oven will be lit a little later. For now, the flat dish is sufficient. It is a large, slightly curved ceramic piece, unglazed, set over a small fire of dry reeds and wood chips, and it has been heating slowly while the dough rested. When the surface is hot enough, the dough is pressed flat with the palms of the hands, not perfectly even but roughly circular, perhaps the thickness of 2 or 3 fingers, and it is placed gently on the hot surface. The sound it makes when it touches the heat is soft, a brief low hiss that fades almost immediately, and then there is silence again, and the smell of the bread beginning to cook, which is one of the most quietly pleasant smells in the world, regardless of where in that world you happen to be. There is something in the smell of cooking bread that does something to the human mind, something that has nothing to do with history or archaeology or the careful reconstruction of ancient daily life, something that is simply immediate and animal and deeply uncomplicated good. The warmth, the grain smell, the faint hint of something caramelizing at the edges. The bread takes a few minutes on each side. It is turned carefully with a flat piece of wood, and when it comes off the heat, it is pale golden on the outside, a little darker at the edges, and it is set on a flat stone in the courtyard to cool slightly. It will not cool for very long before it is eaten. Bread in ancient Egypt was life. This is not an exaggeration or a poetic flourish. It is simply the literal truth of how things were. Workers received bread as part of their wages. The people who built the great stone monuments and temples and tombs were fed on bread, on beer made from fermented grain, on onions and beans, and sometimes fish, but bread above all. The archives and records that have survived from this period, the careful administrative texts written on papyrus and painted on the walls of storage rooms, list bread endlessly. How much grain was stored, how much flour was ground, how many loaves were baked, how many loaves were distributed. Bread was so fundamental to the idea of sustenance and survival that it became embedded in the very language of value, in the way people thought about what they owed each other and what they were owed. This is not the kind of historical fact that requires emphasis or excitement. It is simply a quiet, settled truth, the kind that becomes more, not less, interesting the longer and more slowly you sit with it. People ate bread here every day, in the same way that the river flooded every year and the sun rose every morning, in the same way that emmer wheat grew along the banks, and the flat grinding stones were slowly smoother, and the ovens held their heat through the long, warm afternoons. The oven is lit now. The larger clay oven in the corner of the courtyard is conical in shape, narrowing toward the top, and a fire has been built inside it from dried reeds and small pieces of acacia wood. The fire burns for a while, and the clay of the oven walls absorbs the heat, and then the fire is allowed to die down, and the embers are raked out or pushed to the sides, and the interior of the oven is hot and dry and ready. This is a retained heat oven, one that cooks not by direct flame, but by the warmth held in its thick clay walls, and it is a technology that is older than anyone knows, and that will persist in various forms and materials for thousands of years, all the way to the wood-fired stone ovens of European bakers in the Middle Ages and beyond. The dough that was prepared earlier has been divided and shaped. Some of it is made into flat rounds, thin enough to cook quickly on the hot oven floor. Some of it is shaped into longer oval forms that will be placed against the interior walls of the oven, the wet dough sticking to the hot clay and cooking from both sides at once, the outside forming a thin crust while the inside stays soft. These oval loaves will be pulled away from the oven wall with a long, flat wooden tool when they are done, and they will come free with a soft sound, slightly hollow, already beginning to release their warmth into the air. It takes patience and experience to know when the bread is ready. There is no thermometer, no timer, no recipe book open on a nearby surface. There is only the look and smell and sound of the bread itself, the deepening color of the crust, the particular hollow sound when you tap the bottom of the loaf with a knuckle, the smell that shifts from raw grain and hot clay to something richer and more golden, something that speaks of doneness without any need for words. The person doing the baking knows these signs, has known them since childhood, perhaps, having watched an older relative do exactly the same thing, having learned by standing close and paying attention, and gradually, over many seasons, internalizing the knowledge into the hands and nose and eyes, rather than into words or instructions. There is something very calming about this kind of knowledge, this embodied, quiet expertise that lives not in text or theory, but in the slow accumulation of mornings spent near an oven, in the particular warmth of hands that have kneaded thousands of pieces of dough and come to know without thinking exactly when the dough is ready and when it is not. When the bread comes out of the oven, it is set on the flat stone in the shade of the fig tree and left to cool. Not long. There are people waiting. Let us rest here for a moment, in this courtyard, in this morning. The bread is cooling on the stone. The fig tree makes a small, intermittent shadow over it as a faint breeze moves through the courtyard. The oven is still warm, its clay walls radiating heat slowly into the air. The smell of the bread is all around, that warm, familiar, ancient smell that has been part of human mornings for as long as there have been human mornings to speak of. In a little while, the bread will be torn and shared and eaten with onions and a little salt, perhaps with some soft beans that have been cooking slowly in a clay pot since before dawn. It will be eaten quickly and without ceremony, because it is not a feast day and there is work to do, but it will be eaten with the quiet satisfaction that comes from something that is exactly what it needs to be, simple and sufficient, and made by familiar hands. Nothing dramatic happens here. This is an ordinary morning in an ordinary household in an ancient country, and its ordinariness is precisely what makes it beautiful, in the way that all very old and very ordinary things are beautiful when you sit still long enough to look at them. Let us move slowly to another place. Let us walk along the river, past the houses and the date palms, past the boats that are tied to wooden posts at the water's edge, past the fields that are green and flat and very quiet in the growing heat of the morning. Let us walk until we come to a larger building, set back a little from the river, with a wide entrance and the sound of many people at work inside, the sound of grinding and mixing, and the deeper sound of larger ovens, more than one, working steadily. This is a professional bakery, one of the larger establishments that provided bread to the workers of a nearby temple complex or administrative center. It is a different kind of place from the domestic courtyard we just left, busier and warmer and louder in a low, steady way, but not frantic, not chaotic. It has the purposeful rhythm of a place where the same work is done every day in the same sequence, where each person knows their role and carries it out without confusion or delay. There are several large stone grinding installations here, deeper and heavier than the household version, and they are being worked by multiple people at once, their movements synchronized into a slow, steady rhythm. The grain is emmer wheat again, poured from large sacks into the upper stone in measured amounts, and the flour that accumulates beneath the lower stone is swept regularly into large clay containers. The sound of the grinding fills the room steadily, like a low current of sound that one stops noticing after a while, the way one stops noticing the sound of a river when one lives beside it. The flour from these larger grinding operations is somewhat coarser than what was made this morning in the domestic courtyard, because speed and volume matter here more than fineness. But the bakers know how to work with this flour, how much water to add to bring it to the right consistency, how long to work the dough to develop it properly. They have been doing this for years. Their arms and hands are strong from the constant work of kneading, and they move through the dough with an efficiency that looks almost effortless from the outside. The ovens here are larger too, built into the walls of the building, heated with fires of acacia wood and dried cattle dung, which burns hot and steadily and is a fuel that has been used in this part of the world since before the first pyramid was raised. The ovens are attended constantly by 2 or 3 people whose entire job is to maintain the fire and the temperature, who read the heat the way we might read a clock, by feel and experience, and the subtle language of flame and ember. When the loaves come out of these ovens, they are stacked in rows, pale tan and slightly domed, cooling in the air that moves through the wide entrance of the building. Some of them will be distributed today, carried in baskets to the people who have been assigned to receive them. Some will be stored carefully in a dry room at the back of the building, where they will keep for several days without becoming inedible. The bread made here is not decorated or special. It is workaday bread, made efficiently and in volume, and it does its job, which is to feed people quietly and reliably. And there is nothing wrong with that. There is something very right about it, actually. Something that speaks of a well organized and functional society in which people understood the logistics of feeding large groups of people and had worked out over many generations how to do it reliably. The administrative records that tell us about this bread, the lists of grain received and flour ground and loaves distributed, are not romantic or poetic documents. They are careful and precise and slightly dry in the way of all administrative documents. But they tell a story of their own, the story of a society that took bread seriously enough to count it and record it and plan for it, because they understood that without it, nothing else worked. This is quietly a profound thing. We have been in Egypt long enough, perhaps. Let us let the river carry us forward in times, gently, without any sudden movement. Imagine the surface of the water, dark and slow in the early evening, carrying the last pink light of the setting sun. The river does not care about the passage of centuries. It simply flows, as it has always flowed, carrying silt from distant mountains and depositing it on the flat plain below, making the land rich and dark and ready for grain. We let the current carry us. We do not travel very fast. We drift the way thoughts drift just before sleep, passing through time the way the river passes through landscape, without fully noticing the changes until we look up and find ourselves somewhere entirely different. Now we are somewhere else. We are in Mesopotamia, in the land between two rivers, in a place and time we might imagine as roughly 5,000 years ago, though the truth is that bread was being made here for a very long time before and after that particular moment, and the scene we are about to enter would look broadly similar across a range of many centuries. The light here is different from the Egyptian light, though both are warm and ancient. The sky is perhaps a little less saturated, a little more golden at this hour, and the land around us is flat and very wide, and in the distance we can see the low shapes of a city, its walls and buildings rising from the plain in a kind of stepped arrangement, with a large temple structure visible above everything else, its form simplified by distance into clean horizontal lines. We are not going to the city. We are going to a village at the edge of cultivated land, where the barley fields begin, and where the sound of the city is only a very faint presence in the background, like the memory of something rather than the thing itself. Barley was the great grain of this part of the world in this period, alongside emmer wheat, and it grew here in long wind-moved rows, its heads heavy with grain in the harvest season. It was used for bread and also for beer, which was made by fermenting barley bread in water, a process that produced something mildly alcoholic and also provided nutrition and was drunk by everyone, workers and priests, and children alike, from clay cups and through long reed straws to avoid the sediment that settled at the bottom. But we are here for the bread. In a low building near the edge of the village, a fire has been burning since before dawn, and the flat clay tray over it has been in use since early morning, producing round, flat barley breads that are stacked in a slow-growing pile near the wall. The smell is different from the wheat bread of Egypt, earthier and slightly more bitter, but still warm and nourishing in the same fundamental way. Still the smell of grain transformed by heat into something dense and satisfying. The person tending the bread today is sitting cross-legged near the fire, turning the flat rounds with practiced hands, not hurrying, not distracted. Outside, the morning work of the village continues at its own pace. Someone is carrying water in clay pots from the irrigation channel. Someone is tending animals in a small pen nearby. Someone is repairing a section of wall with mud plaster, smoothing it with flat hands in long strokes, the way they have done many times before. The sounds of these activities are low and steady and do not disturb the morning in any particular way. Not much changes in this village from one day to the next. The rhythms of grain and bread and water and animal care are so deeply established, so completely integrated into the fabric of daily life, that they have ceased to feel like activities and have become simply the texture of time itself. This is what it is to live close to the ground, close to the grain, close to the fire. There is a quality of attention in it that is very different from hurry. It is the quality of someone who is not doing something in order to finish it and move on to the next thing, but who is simply doing it because this is what is done, because this is the shape of the day. The flat barley breads are ready. They are torn and eaten with a thick porridge of boiled grain, slightly sour from a small amount of fermented material mixed in, eaten from clay bowls with the fingers or with small pieces of the bread itself used as a kind of scoop. The meal is not beautiful in any particular way. It is functional and ancient, and it does what it needs to do, which is to sit in the stomach and sustain the people who eat it through the long working morning that follows. Gently now, let us move again. We are going north and west, following the old routes that people have always followed, the paths along rivers and through mountain passes and across the slowly changing landscapes of the ancient world. We are not in a hurry. We are not traveling light-footedly through history the way a tour might, offering highlights and turning quickly to the next spectacle. We are moving the way people actually moved in the ancient world, slowly and with attention, stopping when something deserves to be stopped at. We are going to Greece, in time and place, to a period several centuries before the Common Era, when bread was becoming more complex and more varied and more central to the culture and economy of a world that was becoming, slowly and unevenly, more organized. The light in Greece is sharp and bright, and the shadows are deep, and the smell of the sea is always present in the background, salt and something cool underneath the warmth. We are in a small town on the coast, not one of the great cities, not Athens or Corinth or any name you would recognize from history books, just a small settlement of white plastered buildings near a harbor where fishing boats are tied and the water is very blue and very clear. There is a bakery here, an actual dedicated bakery, a commercial operation where bread is made every day and sold or distributed to the people of the town, which is a relatively recent development in the long history of bread. The idea of a specialized place where bread is made by specialists rather than in every household as part of the general business of daily life. The baker wakes very early, well before dawn, because the bread needs to be ready by the time the morning is fully arrived, and people begin to come looking for it. The bakery has a large stone oven at its center, built from fired clay bricks, its interior lined with flat stones that hold heat beautifully and give the bottom of the bread a particular quality, a firmness and slight crispness that is different from the softer bottom of bread cooked on clay. The dough has been mixed the evening before and left to ferment overnight. It is wheat dough made from flour that has been ground in the mill at the edge of town, which is powered by a donkey walking in slow circles, turning the upper millstone against the lower one in an endless patient revolution that produces flour steadily and without complaint. The millstone itself is a beautiful piece of engineering, heavy and precise, shaped to leave a gap between the stones that produces flour of the right fineness, not too coarse and not too fine. The miller takes pride in this adjustment, in the way that all craftspeople who have spent long years at their craft come to take a particular quiet pride in the small technical distinctions that most people would never notice. The overnight dough has risen slowly in a large clay jar covered with a cloth, and in the morning it is full of bubbles when the cloth is lifted, alive with the gas produced by the wild yeasts and bacteria that have been working quietly through the cool night hours. This is leavened bread, bread that will be light and somewhat airy compared to the flat, unleavened breads of earlier times, and it smells already of fermentation, a faintly sour, yeasty smell that is not unpleasant at all, but is simply the smell of something alive doing its slow, quiet work. The baker works the dough by hand, pressing and folding and turning it on a large flat stone surface that has been dusted with flour. The movement is rhythmic and unhurried, the way all skilled physical work tends to be when the person doing it is experienced, when the body knows the work well enough to let the mind drift a little, to exist in the pleasant half attention of familiar occupation. The dough firms and smooths under the working hands. It becomes cohesive and elastic, springing back slowly when pressed, a sign that it is ready. It is shaped into round loaves, not very large, each one fitting comfortably in both hands. They are placed on the flat stone of the oven floor, which is hot enough to begin cooking the bottom of the loaf immediately, and the oven door is closed, or rather a large flat stone is placed over the oven opening to hold the heat inside. The baking takes time. The baker does other things while it proceeds, sweeps the bakery floor with a bundle of reeds, fills the large water jar from the cistern outside, sorts through the sacks of grain that were delivered yesterday. The morning light comes through the low doorway of the bakery in a long pale bar, touching the flour dust that hangs in the air and making it briefly golden. When the loaves are done, they are round and slightly domed, and the color of very pale straw on the outside, with a crust that is firmed and set beautifully from the hot stone below and the retained heat above. They are pulled from the oven with a long-handled wooden paddle and set on a rack in the doorway where the morning air can move around them. They steam gently as they cool. The smell fills the street outside, and people begin to appear, coming from the direction of the harbor or the fields, carrying small clay or wooden containers to receive their bread, or holding out the coin or measure of grain that is the price of a loaf. This exchange is quiet and quick and utterly ordinary, the same transaction that will be repeated every morning, the baker handing bread through the doorway, the people of the town receiving it and moving on with their days. There is something worth sitting with here in this Greek bakery in the early morning. The Greeks had many words for bread and many different kinds of bread, which tells us something important. That by this period, bread had become not just a staple, but a nuanced thing, a thing that could be made in different ways for different purposes, and that people had developed opinions about and preferences for. There was bread made from wheat and bread made from barley, and wheat bread was generally considered finer and more desirable, though barley bread was more common because barley grew more reliably in the Greek climate and was less expensive. There was bread made with olive oil mixed into the dough, which made it rich and soft, and bread made with honey, which made it subtly sweet and was associated with particular occasions. There was thin flatbread and thick risen bread, bread baked on a stone, and bread baked in clay pots. This variety is a sign of a sophisticated food culture, a culture that had been working with grain and bread for long enough to understand its possibilities, to push past simple necessity into something more like pleasure and preference. It is not the variety of a culture that eats bread because it must, but of a culture that has come to know bread well enough to love it in its different forms. And bread was not only food in ancient Greece, it was present in religious life, offered at altars, used in rituals, shaped into particular forms for particular sacred occasions. Some of these shaped ritual breads were made in the forms of animals or human figures, or of simple geometric shapes that carried symbolic meaning within particular religious practices. The act of baking and offering bread was a way of participating in something larger than daily life, a way of connecting the ordinary domestic activity of feeding people to the larger questions of gratitude and meaning and continuity that religion in all its forms has always addressed. This too is worth knowing, not as an academic fact, but as a quiet reminder that bread has always been more than just food, has always carried more weight than simple nutrition, has always been tangled up with meaning and memory and the deeper human need for things that are familiar and reliable and good. The morning in the bakery is fading now, giving way to the fuller heat of midday, and the bread that was baked in the early hours has been distributed, and the bakery is quiet. Let us leave it gently and move forward through time again. We are going to Rome. The city of Rome at its height was enormous, truly enormous in a way that was almost unprecedented in the ancient world, and feeding it was one of the great logistical challenges of its time. At the peak of its population, the city held perhaps 1 million people, all of whom needed to eat every day, and bread was the foundation of that daily eating in a way that was perhaps even more systematic and organized than it had been in Egypt or Greece or anywhere else. We are not going to enter the city itself tonight because the city is large and complex and full of noise and movement that might not be conducive to the slow and sleepy atmosphere we are trying to maintain. Instead, we are going to approach from outside, from the road that leads into the city from the south, and we are going to stop at a flour mill on the outskirts, where the work of turning grain into flour for the city's enormous needs is being carried out by a combination of water power and animal power, the great millstones turning steadily in the background, the flour accumulating in pale drifts around their bases. The smell here is mostly grain, the dry, slightly dusty smell of freshly milled flour mixed with the smell of the water that powers the larger mills and the faint warm smell of the animals that power the others. It is not an unpleasant smell, just a working smell, the smell of a place that is perpetually occupied with its necessary task. We are not going to stay here long either. We are going to let the flour continue its journey in sacks loaded onto the backs of animals or into wheeled carts, moving into the city toward the bakeries where it will be transformed into the bread that feeds 1 million people. There were hundreds of bakeries in the city of Rome at the height of the empire. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is simply a historical fact supported by the evidence found in the ruins of the city and in the written records that have survived. Some of these bakeries were large commercial operations, some were smaller neighborhood establishments, and some were attached to wealthy households and produced bread primarily for the members of that household and their dependents. The equipment used in these bakeries was varied and somewhat ingenious. Some used donkey-powered mills built into the structure of the bakery itself, the millstones part of the building rather than a separate operation, so that flour was milled and bread was baked all in one continuous process from grain to loaf. Some had elaborate kneading machines, mechanical devices that reduced the labor of working large amounts of dough by hand. The ovens were wood-fired, built into the walls, vaulted and efficient, able to bake large numbers of loaves in a single loading. We know all this because the city of Pompeii, frozen by volcanic ash in 79 of the Common Era, preserved many bakeries almost exactly as they were on the day of the eruption, complete with their mills and ovens, and in some cases, even with loaves of bread still waiting to be eaten, carbonized to black but retaining the circular scored shape of Roman bread as clearly as if they had been baked yesterday. When those loaves were uncovered and studied centuries later, they told a story both remarkable and very ordinary. That on the morning of the eruption, the bakers of Pompeii had been doing exactly what they did every morning, which was making bread, and the bread had been baking in the oven, and the oven had been warm, and the morning had been proceeding in its completely ordinary way. There is something very quiet and very still about knowing this. Let us sit with Rome for a while, not with its politics or its battles or its complicated emperors, but with its bread. Roman bread came in many shapes and sizes. The most common everyday bread was round and slightly domed, scored on top with lines or patterns before baking, both for decorative reasons and practical ones, since scoring the dough helps it expand evenly in the oven. Some loaves were shaped like flowers when viewed from above, with deep score lines dividing the dome into segments. And these segments helped the eater tear the bread apart cleanly without a knife. Some bread was baked in rectangular tins, producing loaves of a different shape, denser and higher. Some was flatbread, thin and crunchy, more like a cracker than what we might think of as bread, eaten with olive oil and salt and perhaps some strong cheese. The finest bread in Rome was made from the whitest, most finely sifted flour, from which most of the bran had been removed in the sifting process. leaving flour that was very pale and produced bread with a fine, close crumb and a thin, delicate crust. This bread was expensive and was associated with wealth and refinement. Coarser bread, made from flour that retained more bran and sometimes mixed with other grains, was the bread of ordinary people, darker in color and denser in texture, but nourishing and filling and produced in enormous quantities every day. There was also a kind of bread distributed free or at very low cost to the poorest residents of the city as part of the grain dole, the system by which the Roman government distributed grain to the urban poor as a matter of both social policy and political necessity. This grain was ground and baked into bread by the recipients or by commercial bakers who received the grain in bulk and distributed the finished bread, and it was the most basic and plain of all the city's breads, without any additional ingredients, without olive oil or honey or seeds or herbs, just grain and water and fire. Bread of this kind fed people who might otherwise have had very little to eat. It kept them alive and moderately nourished through the long, difficult years of being poor in a very large city, far from any field, far from any garden, entirely dependent on the complex machinery of trade and distribution and civic organization to provide the most basic necessities of daily life. There is nothing romantic about poverty or about the bare minimum of subsistence, but there is something quietly significant about the fact that a society as large and complex as Rome understood that bread was not a luxury or a convenience but a right, something that everyone needed, and that a functioning society was obligated to provide, at least at the most basic level. We are going to leave the great city behind us now and travel north and west, following the old roads, the paved stone roads that radiated from Rome in all directions like the spokes of a wheel, carrying armies and merchants and messages and ideas to the edges of a very large world. The further we travel from the city, the quieter the roads become, and the further back in time we gently slide, the smaller and quieter the world becomes around us. By the time we reach the place we are going next, we are in a very different kind of quiet from the quiet of the Roman morning. This is the deeper quiet of the early medieval world, several centuries after Rome's collapse, when many things had become simpler and more local and more intimate, when the great systems of trade and organization had broken down, and what remained was the smaller, more immediate world of the village and the valley and the monastery on the hill. We are in what will one day be called France, but tonight is simply a wooded country of low hills and river valleys, with small settlements clustered around good water sources and fertile land, and the occasional walled monastery sitting on a rise overlooking the village below. Let us go to the monastery. It is a gray stone building, not very large, surrounded by a low wall that marks its separation from the world outside without being hostile to it. Inside the wall, there are gardens, carefully tended, and a small orchard of apple and pear trees, and a kitchen garden where vegetables and herbs grow in neat rows, and beyond these the cluster of stone buildings that make up the monastery itself, the church, the dormitory, the refectory where meals are taken, the chapter house, and the bakery. The bakery is a long, low building with a flagstone floor and a wide chimney and two large ovens built into the far wall, their arched openings framed in carefully fitted stone that is blackened from long use. The ovens are currently cooling after yesterday's bake, but they will be lit again tomorrow morning because bread is baked every day here without exception, in the same quantities and at the same times, governed by the same schedule that governs everything in this place, the rhythm of the daily offices, the sequence of prayer and work and rest and prayer again, that structures time in a monastery into a kind of very orderly, very predictable, very peaceful pattern. Tonight the bakery is empty and the ovens are dark and cool, but the smell of bread is still in the air, sunk into the walls and the stone floor and the wooden shelves where the loaves are placed to cool, a deep, warm grain smell that does not fade entirely between bakings, that has been accumulating in the walls of this building for decades, perhaps for longer than anyone now living can remember. There is something very peaceful about empty baking spaces in the evening. The work is done, the tools are clean and put away, the shelves hold the evidence of the day's labor, and the space itself is resting, the way people rest after a full day of useful work, not emptily but deeply, with the particular quiet satisfaction of a place that has served its purpose well. In the morning, before the first light, one of the brothers has risen early to light the ovens. He moves quietly through the dormitory and down the stone stairs and across the courtyard, where the air is cool and very still, and the sky above is a deep blue-black with a few pale stars still visible near the horizon. His habit is thick wool, not particularly warm, but familiar, and his feet in their sandals make a small sound on the stone of the courtyard that is the only sound in the world at this particular moment. The bakery is slightly warmer than the courtyard because the stones hold some heat, even hours after the ovens have been emptied, and he is grateful for this small warmth as he sets to work, building the fire. He has done this hundreds of times, and his movements are economical and certain. The tinder of dry grass and bark, the small pieces of kindling, the larger pieces of wood placed carefully so that the fire will take hold and spread evenly. The flint strikes, the spark catches, the tinder breathes smoke, and then quietly, with a small sound like a soft intake of breath, becomes flame. He feeds the fire slowly, adding wood in measured increments, and the oven begins to heat. The process takes a long time, perhaps an hour or more, and while the oven heats, he prepares the dough. The sour starter has been sitting in its clay jar since the previous day, fed with fresh flour and water the evening before, and left to work through the night, and it is active and slightly bubbly when he uncovers it and leans in to smell it, which he always does, a habit of assessment, checking that the fermentation is proceeding correctly, that the smell is right, neither too sharp nor too flat, the right balance of sourness and grain that tells him the bread made from this starter will be good. He measures flour by feel and long practice, not by any instrument of measurement. He mixes in water, adding it slowly, and then the starter, folding it through the flour with his hands until everything comes together into a rough, shaggy mass. He leaves this to rest for a little while, covered with a piece of linen cloth, while the oven continues to heat. This initial rest is important. It allows the flour to absorb the water fully, allows the mass to begin to come together on its own before he works it further. He has learned this through experience, through the many times he has made this bread, and the very occasional times when something has gone wrong, when the bread has come out too dense or too pale or wrong in some way that he cannot always fully explain, but can always clearly feel when he holds the finished loaf in his hands, that slight wrongness in the weight or texture that tells him something in the process was not quite right. But most days it is right. Most days the bread is good. After the rest, he works the dough with both hands on the flour-dusted stone surface of the long work table, pressing it away from him and folding it back, turning it, pressing again. The dough changes under his hands over the course of this working, from rough and slightly sticky to smooth and cohesive, from something that tears when pulled to something that stretches and springs back, from something raw and inactive to something that feels almost alive, almost responsive, as if it knows what it is meant to become. The dough is divided into portions and shaped into oval loaves and placed on wooden boards that have been dusted with flour, and they are covered again with linen and left in a warm corner of the bakery near the oven to rise. This rising takes an hour, perhaps more, depending on the temperature of the room and the vigor of the starter. He checks them periodically, pressing gently with one finger to see how the dough responds, watching for the slow, steady increase in their size that tells him the fermentation is active and the bread is developing as it should. Meanwhile, he has tested the oven. He reaches his hand briefly into the opening and counts in his head, the old method of determining temperature by how long you can hold your hand in the heat before you must pull it back. The oven is very hot. He knows this means it needs to cool slightly before the bread goes in, so he rakes the embers to the sides and back, clearing the stone floor of the oven, and leaves the door open for a few minutes to let the fiercest of the heat escape. Then, when the time is right, when the bread has risen enough and the oven has settled to the right temperature, he loads the loaves onto the long wooden peel, the flat paddle used for this purpose, and slides them one by one onto the oven floor. The dough meets the hot stone and begins to transform immediately, the crust forming from the heat below while the interior continues to rise and set from the heat, radiating from the walls and ceiling of the oven. He closes the oven door with the large flat stone that serves this purpose and steps back and waits. The smell fills the bakery. It fills the corridor outside the bakery. It drifts across the courtyard and mingles with the morning air. By now, the sky has lightened to a pale pearl gray, and the first birds are awake, and the monastery is beginning to stir. The sound of sandals on stone flagging audible from the direction of the church, where the first office of the day is being sung. The voices low and very calm, rising and falling in long, unhurried phrases. This is the sound of the day beginning in this place. Every day, bread baking and voices singing, and the slow light filling the stone corridors. The bread from monastery ovens fed not only the monks, but also the poor of the surrounding area, who came on certain days to receive a portion of bread at the monastery gate. This practice of charitable bread distribution was common in the medieval world, where monasteries and great houses and churches served as points of distribution for food that might otherwise have been inaccessible to the poorest people of the surrounding landscape. The bread distributed in this way was not necessarily the finest bread, was not the best wheat bread of the refectory table, but it was bread, and it was given without great ceremony or elaborate ritual, simply passed through the gate in an exchange that was ordinary enough to have been repeated without comment in the records of the monastery, noted in the accounts simply as so many loaves distributed on such a day. There is something in this that deserves a moment of quiet attention, the way bread moved through the social world of the medieval period, from the grain grown in the fields of the manor or the monastery farm, to the mill where it was ground, to the bakery where it was transformed, to the table of the wealthy and the gate of the poor. Bread moved through all layers of that world, connecting them in a way that few other things did, reminding everyone, at least for a moment, of the same fundamental human need for something simple and nourishing and warm. Let us move through the medieval world now, slowly and without urgency, pausing here and there to notice things. We are in England in what might be called the High Medieval period, perhaps the 12th or 13th century, in a village in the Midlands or the North, where the fields around the village are divided into long strips, and each family has its allocation of strips, and the work of the fields is done according to the communal schedule of planting and harvesting that has governed this village for as long as anyone can remember, and that will continue to govern it for a long time after anyone now living has passed on. The wheat here is a somewhat different variety from the emmer wheat of ancient Egypt, harder and more robust, adapted over many generations of cultivation to the cooler, wetter conditions of northern Europe. But it is still wheat, still the same fundamental grain, still producing the same fundamental flour that has been the basis of bread for thousands of years. In this village there is a mill, a water mill this time, set on the small stream that runs through the low ground at the edge of the village. Its wooden wheel turns slowly in the current, and the millstone inside turns with it, and the grain brought by the villagers is ground into flour and returned to them, minus the miller's portion, which is the customary fee for the use of the mill. The miller and his family are people of some local standing, not wealthy in any way that would register as wealthy in a larger context, but with a reliable income in flour and a certain amount of social importance in a community where the mill is an absolute necessity. The mill turns all day when there is grain to be ground, and the sound of it is a constant background in the village, a low rumbling and splashing that the villagers stopped hearing long ago, the way you stop hearing any sound that is always present. The flour produced here is not very refined, not very white. It contains a substantial proportion of bran, the outer husk of the wheat grain, and this gives it a somewhat dark color and a somewhat coarse texture, and a flavor that is more assertive and earthy than refined white flour. But this is the flour that makes the bread that feeds this village, and no one who eats it every day would describe it as inferior. It is simply bread. It is what bread tastes like. It is what food tastes like. The village bread is baked in a communal oven, which is a large stone oven set in a small stone building near the center of the village, owned and maintained by the lord of the manor and available to the villagers for their baking on certain days of the week in exchange for a small payment in kind. The communal oven is an efficient arrangement that makes sense in a world where fuel is not unlimited and where a large stone oven requires a great deal of wood to heat properly and holds enough heat once heated to bake many loaves in a single session. Rather than every household maintaining and heating its own oven, which would require enormous amounts of wood and would produce the same quality of bread anyway. The village shares a single large oven and organizes the use of it according to a schedule that is understood by everyone, and that, like most arrangements in village life, runs on the basis of long custom and mutual obligation rather than any written rule. On baking day, the oven is lit early by whoever has the duty of lighting it this week, and it is heated for several hours until it has reached the right temperature, and then the embers are cleared and the first family's loaves are loaded in. When those are done, they are removed and the next family's loaves go in, and so on through the morning, the oven slowly giving up its stored heat with each successive baking, so that the first loaves, cooked in the hottest oven, come out with the crispest, darkest crusts, and the last loaves of the morning come out softer and paler, the oven having spent most of its heat in the earlier bakings. Every family brings its own dough, prepared at home, shaped and ready to go straight into the oven. The preparation of the dough begins the day before baking day, with the mixing of flour and water and the leavening, which in this context is most often a small amount of old dough kept back from the last baking, the sourdough starter that has been maintained in this village, in this continuous chain of kept dough and new dough, for so long that no one can say with any certainty when it began. The mixing and kneading of the dough is typically done in the evening before baking day, so that it can ferment slowly overnight and be ready to shape and load first thing in the morning. It is done in a large wooden trough that most households kept for exactly this purpose, called a dough trough or kneading trough, a long, shallow container that could hold a substantial amount of dough and that over time absorbed the flour and the faint yeastiness of the dough into its grain so that it smelled permanently and pleasantly of old bread. The kneading itself is hard work. This is not a delicate process. The dough is heavy because this is whole grain flour with a good deal of brawn in it, and it takes sustained effort to work it to the smoothness and elasticity that good bread requires. The person doing the kneading stands or kneels at the trough and works with the heels of both hands, pressing the dough away and folding it back, and the rhythm of this work is slow and steady, somewhat meditative, somewhat tiring, but not unpleasant in the way of most physical work that is done at a measured pace with a clear purpose. By the time the kneading is done, the evening is usually well advanced, and the fire in the house is low, and the dough is covered with a cloth and left in the warmth near the remaining embers, and the family goes to sleep. In the morning, the dough has risen. Not dramatically, not the way a heavily yeasted modern dough rises, but visibly, discernibly larger and softer and more alive feeling than it was the night before, with a slightly sour smell that tells you the fermentation has been working through the quiet hours. It is shaped quickly, divided and pressed into the forms that will fit in the oven, scored on top with a knife or the edge of a finger and carried to the communal oven in a large cloth or a wooden board. The bread that comes out of the communal oven in the late morning is carried home and set to cool on the windowsill or the doorstep, and the smell of it drifts through the village in a comfortable wave, mixing with the smell of wood smoke and the faint smell of animals from the pens nearby, and the smell of earth and green things from the fields beyond. This bread will be eaten over the next several days. It is not bread meant to be eaten immediately while still warm, the way we might eat a fresh loaf today. It is sturdy bread made for keeping, and it gets harder as it ages, which is not a problem, but simply a characteristic to be managed. Hard bread can be soaked in broth and becomes soft again. Hard bread can be scraped with a knife, and the scraped crumbs can be used to thicken a soup. Hard bread can be cut into slices and used as a plate for other food, the old practice of the trencher, where a thick slice of stale bread served as the surface on which meat and vegetables were placed, and which absorbed their juices and could itself be eaten at the end of the meal, or given to the animals or to the poor. Nothing of the bread is wasted. In a world where grain is the product of many months of labor and uncertain weather, where the failure of the harvest means real hunger and real hardship, bread is too precious to waste any part of. Even the crumbs swept from the table have their uses. Even the hardest, most stale ends of a loaf can be soaked back to usefulness. This is not a lesson or a moral. It is simply how things were in a world where the margin between enough and not enough was narrow and always present, where bread was not one option among many, but the thing itself, the substance of daily life in the most literal sense. There is something worth staying with in this village, in this quietness of medieval daily life, that we do not always imagine accurately when we think about the past. We tend to imagine the medieval world as dramatic, full of battles and plagues and religious crisis and political upheaval, and certainly all of those things were real and present in that world. But the daily texture of most people's lives was not dramatic. It was slow and repetitive and physical and fundamentally organized around the same handful of recurring tasks: growing and processing grain, tending animals, maintaining buildings and tools, preparing food, raising children, marking the passage of seasons and years with the communal rituals of the church calendar. Bread was at the center of this life, not because people thought about it or talked about it, but precisely because they didn't. It was so fundamental, so assumed, so deeply built into the rhythm of the week and the year that it required no comment, no attention, no special appreciation. It was simply there, the way the fields were there, and the mill was there, and the church was there, permanent features of a known and understood world. There is something very calm about this, actually. The permanence, the repetition, the way the same morning comes every morning, and the same bread is made in the same trough, and baked in the same oven, and eaten at the same table, and none of this is remarkable or special. None of it is anything other than ordinary, and ordinary is enough. Ordinary is the very substance of a life, and there is a deep, quiet comfort in that. Let us drift, very slowly, forward in time. We do not need to make a sudden jump. We are going to let the centuries pass the way sleep comes, gradually, the edges of wakefulness blurring and softening, until we find ourselves somewhere different without quite having noticed the transition. We are going to come gently to rest in the early modern period, perhaps the 17th century, in a bakery in a northern European city, one of the many cities that were growing and changing and becoming more complex and more crowded during this period. Cities full of people who had come from the countryside looking for work and who needed to be fed and who could not grow their own grain because they lived on a narrow street 4 stories up and the city provided no land for gardens. The professional baker is more important than ever in this world, and the guild system that has grown up around baking in many European cities is a way of regulating the trade, ensuring quality and consistent practices, protecting the interests of established bakers, while also, in theory at least, protecting the interests of consumers who depend on bread and have no way of producing it for themselves. The bakery we have arrived at is on a cobblestone street in a city we might call Amsterdam or Hamburg or any of a dozen northern European cities that look broadly similar in this period, with their narrow facades and their step gable roof lines and their canals or rivers and their perpetually damp air. The bakery occupies the ground floor of a building, with the baker's family living on the floors above, and it opens onto the street through a wide wooden door that is kept open during the day so that the smell of the bread can reach the street and invite passing customers to stop. Inside, the oven dominates the back of the room, large and efficient, heated with wood and peat, its stone floor and arched brick ceiling producing bread of very consistent quality. The baker has worked in this bakery for many years and knows it as well as he knows his own body, knows the particular way this oven runs hot on the left side and a little cooler on the right, knows how long each type of bread takes at different times of year when the ambient temperature of the room affects the fermentation of the dough, knows the particular local flour from the mill outside the city and how it behaves differently in wet weather than in dry. The bread made here is varied. There are the plain, everyday loaves for the working people of the neighborhood, dense and substantial, made from a reasonably fine wheat flour, mixed with some rye flour to stretch it and reduce the cost. There are the finer white loaves for wealthier customers, made from flour that has been sifted more thoroughly, producing a paler crumb and a more delicate crust. There are rolls, small individual portions that can be slipped into a pocket and carried to work, eaten standing up in the midday break from whatever work the day involves. And then there are the special breads, the breads for particular occasions that appear and disappear with the calendar. The sweet, enriched breads of feast days, made with eggs and butter and a little sugar, braided or twisted into decorative shapes and brushed with a wash of egg to give the crust a golden shine. The dense, dark rye breads that have been fermenting for several days before baking and that will keep for weeks, carried on ships and in carts and eaten by people far from the bakery that made them. The simple flatbreads and crackers that are made in the slack moments between the main bakes and that are bought by people who cannot afford the full price loaves. The baker knows all of these. He can make all of them from memory without reference to any written recipe, though some of his fellow guild members have begun to keep notebooks in which they write down their methods and their ingredient proportions, a new practice that is becoming more common in this period of expanding literacy and expanding commerce. The morning in this city bakery begins even earlier than the monastery bakery we visited, because the city is a more demanding customer than the monks, more numerous, more varied in its needs, and the baker must have bread ready for the first customers who appear before the proper morning has begun, the workers and servants and market people who start their days in the dark. The fire is lit well before midnight. The dough has been prepared the evening before and has been fermenting in the cool back room of the bakery, rising slowly. By the early hours of the morning, the oven is at temperature, and the first loaves are going in. And by the time the sky outside begins to show any light at all, the first baked loaves are cooling on the rack behind the counter. The baker works in near silence in these early hours, moving through the steps of loading and unloading and reshaping and refreshing the dough with a quiet efficiency that is almost private, almost meditative. His apprentice helps with the heavy work of kneading and loading, and the two of them work in a comfortable, largely wordless rhythm, knowing each other's movements well enough that they rarely need to speak. The city outside is quiet at this hour, not silent, never truly silent the way the countryside can be silent, but quieter than it will be in a few hours, with only the occasional sound of someone passing on the cobblestones outside, or the distant sound of a dog, or the water moving in the canal at the end of the street. The bakery is warm in contrast to the cold outside, and the light from the fire and the small oil lamp on the counter is warm-toned and low and steady. When the first loaves are done and set to cool, and the next batch is in the oven, there is a brief, quiet interval when the baker stands by the counter and drinks a cup of warm water mixed with a little vinegar, which is his habit in the mornings, and looks at the loaves cooling on the rack, and thinks nothing in particular, or rather thinks the kind of slow, directionless things that early mornings allow, the way the mind wanders when the body is tired, but the hands have done their work, and there is nothing to do for a few minutes but wait. The loaves are round and oval and rectangular, pale gold on their upper surfaces, with the particular sheen that comes from the steam in the oven, darker on the bottom from the heat of the oven floor, their scored surfaces split neatly along the cuts and opened into soft pale interior, slightly irregular in the most pleasing way. They smell of everything that bread should smell of, warmthies and grain and the very faint sourness of fermentation, and the caramel notes of the crust. Nothing in the world smells quite like this, and nothing about this smell has changed significantly in a very long time. By the time the city wakes properly, the bakery is open and busy, customers coming and going in a steady stream, bread disappearing from the racks and shelves with a quiet regularity. The baker wraps each loaf or bundle of rolls in a piece of coarse cloth, or hands it directly across the counter into waiting hands, and collects the small coins or the occasional exchange of goods, and this continues for several hours until the morning rush is over and the pace slows. The afternoon will bring more baking, a second or third use of the oven, producing the more specialized and time-consuming breads, the sweet, enriched loaves, the rye loaves that need a longer, slower bake. The baker will not stop working until evening, and then he will begin the preparation of the next morning's dough, and then perhaps he will sleep for a few hours before the whole cycle begins again. It is a hard life in some respects. The hours are long, the work is physical, the oven is always hot, the margins of the trade are narrow, but it is also a life of great continuity, of mastery, of making something real and necessary and good every single day, of being a person whose work matters to the people around them in the most immediate and tangible way. The baker knows this, not in any particular or self congratulatory way, but in the way you know things that are simply true about your life, the way you know the smell of your own house or the sound of your own street. It is a knowledge that is part of the background of his days, rather than something he thinks about. Let us pause here, in this northern city, in this warm bakery, and think for a moment about flour. Because flour is not bread, but bread begins with flour, and the story of bread is also the story of the long, slow improvement and refinement of the process of turning grain into flour. This is a story that spans the same vast period of time that the story of bread spans, from the flat grinding stones of the earliest settlements to the great stone mills of the medieval countryside, to the water mills and windmills of the early modern period and beyond. Each step in the development of milling was driven by the same basic desire: to grind more grain more efficiently, to produce finer flour, to reduce the labor and time required to turn hard grain into soft powder. The transition from handheld grinding stones to large rotary millstones powered by water or wind was one of the most significant technological developments in the long history of food, because it removed the enormous labor of grinding from the daily work of every household and transferred it to a specialized and more efficient operation that could produce flour for an entire community or an entire region. The windmill, which appeared in Europe in the medieval period, was a beautiful and efficient solution to the problem of grinding grain in places where fast-flowing water was not available to power a watermill. It stood on a rise or in an open place where the wind was reliable, turning its great wooden sails in the moving air, driving the millstone within, producing flour steadily as long as the wind blew. The millers who ran these mills were skilled in their own right, able to adjust the angle of the sails to catch the wind efficiently, to dress the millstone when it needed its grinding surface restored, to manage the flow of grain to produce flour of the right fineness. A windmill on a hill on a windy day is a beautiful thing to watch from a distance, its sails turning steadily in the gray sky, producing that low, rumbling sound of stone against stone, the same sound that has been the background of milling since the first flat grinding stones. There is something almost hypnotic about the turning of mill sails, the slow, steady, circular motion that converts the random energy of the wind into the precise, purposeful rotation of the millstone. And flour is a beautiful thing when you hold it in your hands. That fineness, oh, that pale weight, the way it drifts between the fingers like a very fine dry powder, leaving the hands soft and white. When you smell it, it smells of grain and of something neutral, almost blank, something that does not yet fully suggest the thing it will become, but that carries within it all the potential of bread. We are going to move forward again, gently through the quiet centuries, and we are going to come to rest in the 19th century in a small town in what we might call Central Europe, in a period when the world is beginning to change more quickly than it has changed before, though in small places and in the daily routines of ordinary life, the change is still slow enough to be barely perceptible. There is a small town bakery here, very old, the same family having operated it for 3 or 4 generations that anyone can trace, possibly longer. The building is narrow with a low ceiling, and the oven is the most prominent feature of the room, large and deep, tiled around the outside in pale cream-colored ceramic, with a wide iron door that swings on heavy hinges. The floor is stone, very smooth from long use, worn to a slight depression in front of the oven door from all the years of standing there, loading and unloading. The family that runs this bakery rises before dawn, like all bakers, and the mother and father and the older children each have their roles in the morning's work. The father tends the oven, feeding it with wood and regulating its temperature with the precise attention of someone who has been doing this for 30 years and who knows this particular oven the way a musician knows a particular instrument, all its quirks and tendencies, where it runs hot, where it is slower. The mother makes the enriched breads, the sweet ones that are made for the weekend market, pressing butter and eggs into soft dough with practiced hands. The older daughter kneads the plain loaves, working at the long wooden table in steady, sustained motion, her hair tied back from her face, moving through the early morning with the comfortable purposefulness of someone who has learned what she knows from someone who also knew it deeply. Outside, the town is beginning to wake. There are sounds of horses on the cobbled street, the rattle of a cart, the voice of someone calling to someone else in the particular tone of a working morning greeting. The bakery windows are small and low and set with thick glass that distorts the view of the street outside into something impressionistic, all shapes and movements rather than clear outlines. The bread being made here is partly familiar and partly new. The plain loaves have changed relatively little over the centuries, still sourdough, still wheat and rye, still shaped by hands on a floured board and baked in a hot stone oven. But there are also some newer things, bread made with yeast that comes from the brewery down the road, commercial yeast, rather than the sourdough starter, which produces a quicker rise and a slightly different flavor, lighter and less sour. The family uses both, depending on the type of bread they are making, understanding by feel and experience the different qualities each kind of leavening produces. There are also now some things that were not present in the earlier centuries we have visited. Refined white flour, produced by the new roller mills that have begun to appear in some of the larger towns, mills that can remove virtually all of the bran and germ from the wheat and produce a flour of astonishing whiteness and fineness. This flour produces bread that is very different in character from the whole grain loaves of previous centuries, lighter and softer and more delicate, and it is considered by the people who can afford it to be superior in every way to the darker, denser whole grain bread. The white bread sits on the bakery shelf looking very pale and very refined, and it costs more than the darker bread, and the wealthy families of the town buy it and take it home and eat it with their good butter and they're good meat, and they consider themselves to be eating something better, something more civilized, something more of their time. The darker, heavier bread also sits on the shelf, and the working families and the poorer families buy it, and they eat it every day, and in many ways it nourishes them rather better than the white bread nourishes the wealthy families, because the bran and germ that were removed from the white flour carried a great deal of the grain's nutritional content, and what remained in the highly refined white flour was essentially starch. But this is not yet widely understood in this period, and the prestige of whiteness and refinement is very powerful, and the white bread is considered the better bread, and that is how it is. Not much changes between one baking day and the next in this small town. The loaves come out and the customers come in, and the smell of bread fills the street, and the day proceeds. We are going to stay in this part of our story for a little longer because there is something quietly important happening in the world of bread during this period that deserves a moment of gentle attention. The industrialization of flour milling, the development of roller mills that could process enormous quantities of grain into very refined flour very quickly, began to change bread in ways that went beyond just the color and texture of the loaf. It changed who made bread and where and how. As commercial flour became cheaper and more consistently available, as commercial yeast became available from breweries and later from dedicated yeast companies, as specialized baking equipment became more accessible, the move away from home baking and toward commercial bakeries accelerated. Families that had been making their own bread every week for generations began to buy it instead, because buying it was cheaper than making it, because the commercial bread was consistent and reliable, because the time and labor saved could be spent on other things. This is not a story of loss exactly, though it has sometimes been told that way. It is a story of change, of the gradual movement of bread from the most intimate and domestic of activities to a more publicly organized one. It is the same shift that happened with many other craft productions as the world industrialized, and it brought with it both genuine benefits, like reliable access to affordable bread for very large numbers of people, and genuine losses, like the slow disappearance of the particular, local, individual quality of bread made by a known person in a specific place from a specific flour. Both of these things are true, and neither cancels the other, and there is no need to feel particularly strongly about either of them this evening. They are simply part of the long, quiet history of bread, one more chapter in a very long story that was never simply about flour and water and fire, but about the whole fabric of how people lived and worked and fed themselves and each other. Let us slow down now. The history of bread could continue for a very long time, and there is much we have not mentioned. The flatbreads of the Middle East and South Asia and the Americas, which have their own long and gentle histories. The discovery in the 19th century of commercial yeast, which fundamentally changed the timescale of baking. The development of sliced bread in the early 20th century. The slow and tentative return of sourdough and whole grain baking that has been happening in recent decades, a kind of quiet rediscovery of older methods. But we are not going to rush through all of that. We have been traveling for a long time tonight, from the earliest fire to the medieval monastery to the city bakeries of early modern Europe, and the hour is late, and the air in our imaginary room is warm, and the bread smell is still there, faint and ancient and comfortable, and it is time to slow down and let things settle. Let us just be here for a little while, in the general warmth of all these baking rooms we have visited, in the composite smell of all that bread, all those mornings, all those fires and floured hands and cooling loaves set on stones and shelves and windowsills. Somewhere in that very long story, in some particular morning we have not specifically visited, someone was baking bread for the last time without knowing it was the last time. An elderly woman in a village somewhere, knotting her dough at the same table she had kneaded it at every week for 60 years, not knowing that she would fall ill before the next baking day, that her daughters would take over the task, that the particular pattern of her hands in the dough would not be repeated. A baker in a city somewhere, loading the oven for what turned out to be the last time in his bakery, before some change of circumstance or fortune closed the place and the oven went cold for good. These are not sad stories, really. They are simply the stories of ordinary endings that are part of the ordinary flow of things. The way one generation's daily bread becomes the next generation's memory, and then the next generation's history, and then simply the long, quiet past, which is where most of our daily bread has always lived, invisibly nourishing the present by being exactly what it was when it was made. The first bread was not beautiful, but it was astonishing. Astonishing in the way that all very simple transformations are astonishing when you stop to notice them. Grain becomes flour, becomes dough, becomes bread. Raw becomes cooked, hard becomes soft, tasteless becomes fragrant, inedible becomes sustaining. Water and heat and time and the invisible work of wild yeasts doing their ancient, patient, microscopic labor, and something entirely new comes into being that did not exist before, that is more than the sum of its parts, that somehow crosses a threshold from mere ingredient to actual food. We have been doing this for thousands of years. We did it before we had words for it. We did it before we had cities, or writing, or organized religion, or anything else we might point to as the marks of a civilization. We did it in river valleys, and on hillsides, and in mountain caves, and in desert settlements, and in cold northern forests, and in hot equatorial places, and in every kind of climate and geography that a human community has ever called home. We did it in the mornings, mostly, when the fire was fresh and the day was beginning, and the need for food was felt most plainly after the long fast of sleep. We did it by hand, all of it by hand, for most of that long history, the mixing and the kneading and the shaping and the placing in the oven and the waiting and the taking out and the cooling and the tearing and the eating. The eating. That is perhaps the most important part, the part we have said least about tonight, because the eating of bread is something that happens in the mouth and the body rather than in the bakery, and it is a private and immediate experience that does not need much description. The feeling of warm bread in the hands, slightly rough and yielding, giving under the fingers when you press. The sound of a good crust, that particular dry crunch that tells you the bread has been well baked and properly cooled. The smell that intensifies when the bread is broken, the interior releasing its warm grain steam. The taste, which is subtle and complex in the way of all fermented things, carrying grain and salt and the faint lingering ghost of the yeast's work, and something underneath that, something very old and very simple that does not have a name, except possibly the name of itself, which is bread. We have been traveling for a long time tonight, and we have covered a great deal of ground, though we have tried to do so slowly, without hurrying, without passing over the quiet and ordinary things that make the history of bread what it is. Not a list of events or dates or technological innovations, but the accumulated weight of mornings, the sediment of all those individual bakings laid one on top of another over thousands of years, building something not grand or dramatic but quietly enormous, the way sediment builds into stone, the stone floor of the Egyptian bakery, the clay walls of the Mesopotamian house, the flagstones of the monastery, the cobblestones of the northern European city, all of them warm from fires and ovens, all of them carrying in their material the memory of heat and grain and work and the particular irreducible smell of bread. It is getting late now. The ovens in all these places are cooling or have been banked for the night, their fires reduced to low embers that will hold enough heat to restart them in the morning without the long labor of relighting from scratch. The bread that was baked today has been eaten or stored or distributed, and the bakers are resting, and the towns and villages and monastery courtyards are quiet. The stars are out, above the Egyptian courtyard with its fig tree, above the medieval village with its communal oven, above the northern European city with its canals, above all the places we have been tonight. The stars are very old, much older than bread, much older than any human story, but they have been present over every baking, shining through every early morning darkness, while bakers rose and lit fires and began their work, indifferent to all of it in the way of very old things, simply there. The grain in the fields is still, the long stalks motionless in the windless night, their heavy heads bowing very slightly toward the ground, filled with the small hard seeds that will become flour, that will become dough, that will become bread, in the slow, inevitable chain of transformation that has been repeating since longer ago than we can fully imagine. Somewhere tonight, bread is being made, in a bakery that opens at 4 in the morning, in a city somewhere. An oven is lit, and dough is being slid onto a hot stone floor, and the smell of it is filling a narrow room where a baker in a flour-dusted apron is watching the color of the crust deepen from pale to gold, listening for the particular hollow sound that tells him the bread is ready. In a village somewhere, a sourdough starter that has been maintained in the same family for decades is being fed its evening portion of flour and water, beginning its slow overnight ferment. In a kitchen somewhere, someone has just taken a loaf out of a domestic oven and set it on a rack to cool, and the smell of it has moved through the house and into the rooms where people are sleeping, or trying to sleep, or lying in the particular comfortable half-wakefulness that late evenings sometimes produce. These are the current representatives of a practice that stretches back into a past so deep that it merges with the very beginning of what it means to be human, to take the raw materials of the world and transform them into food, to use fire and time and the invisible labor of living things to make something nourishing and warm and good. Not much changes about this. Century after century, the same transformation happens. Grain becomes flour, becomes dough, becomes bread. The tools become more sophisticated, the methods more refined, the scale of production vastly larger, but at the heart of it, in the moment when the dough touches the hot surface and begins to change, the thing that happens is the same thing that happened the first time, in some firelit clearing or cave or riverbank settlement so long ago that we can only imagine it. The bread rises, the crust forms, the interior sets, the bread is done. Let us let that be enough for tonight. We have followed bread from its very beginning to its very ordinary, very present, continuous life, and the story has been quiet and long and full of mornings and fires and grinding stones and patient hands. It has been a story about ordinary days, which is to say, it has been a story about most of what life actually consists of, the slow repetition of necessary things done with skill and care and without much drama. The fire is low now. The ovens in all the places we have been tonight are cooling, slowly, their stone and clay and brick walls releasing the day's heat into the evening air, warmth diminishing gradually, imperceptibly, the way all warmth diminishes eventually, gently and without suddenness. The bread is on the shelf, or on the stone, or on the rack, the loaves dark on their bottom surfaces and pale on top, their scored surfaces opened by the heat into soft, pale gullies, cooling in the still air. The smell of them is fading now, becoming just a background thing, familiar and comfortable, the smell of a room that has been used for baking many times, the smell of a place that knows what it is for. The fig tree in the Egyptian courtyard makes no sound in the night air. The water wheel of the medieval mill has stopped turning for the night, the stream moving past it quietly, carrying nothing but its own weight and reflection. The cobblestones of the northern European city are empty and slightly wet in the dark, and the bakery windows are dark, and the smell of bread drifts very faintly up from the cracks under the door, the last remainder of the day's work. Everything is quiet now. Everything is resting in the deep and comfortable way of things that have done their work and done it well, that have no need to do anything else tonight, that can simply be still and warm and at rest in the dark. The grain is in the field, the flour is in the jar, the fire is low, the bread is done, and we can rest now, too, in the warmth of this very long and very gentle story, in the warmth of all those ancient ovens still faintly present in the air around us, in the warmth of knowing that somewhere tonight, as always, the bread is baking, and the morning is coming, and the world is very old and very quiet, and full of the simple, sustaining goodness of grain, and water, and fire, and the patient, practiced hands that have always known what to do with them. Let that warmth settle over you, slowly, like flour drifting down through still morning light. Let your thoughts quiet the way the ovens quiet at the end of the day. Let everything slow, the way the river slows toward evening, reflecting the last light in long, still gleams. The bread is done, the day is done, everything is slow and warm and still. Sleep now.